Thank you. Well, the first question we've had a number of questions on environmental and green issues.
Right.
The question I'm going to take will be from Councillor Jane Brophy from Altrincham and Sale West. And it reads, Nick, will you explain how in the forthcoming election campaign our green credentials and environmental policies will be promoted as a key Liberal Democrat message?
Yes. Do I need this or not? No. Can you hear me? Good? Yes? Right. There you go. I think well, we'll see tomorrow in the debate, in the pre-manifesto. The green thread that runs through it will be very evident to all of us, I think. And I'm not going to sort of run through all the great sort of sweet menu of the environmental policies which is in the pre-manifesto, much of which I'm sure will make it into the manifesto, including, you would have seen, I hope, some weeks ago, Ed Davies' announcement of the 5 green laws that we would want to implement as soon as possible in the next Parliament if we were in government. But there are 3 which I think are particularly kind of associated with us, which I just wanted to highlight. Firstly, garden cities. It's something I've been banging on about for years and years and years. The Conservatives have been resisting it for years and years and years. But we're finally making some progress. I announced this morning that we want to see the completion of the Cambridge to Oxford railway line, so that I have to say, if you clap for that, I'm going to get lots of good claps this afternoon. So anyway, because that railway line, of course, is passing through a part of the country where we think a lot of the new garden cities need to be established. And we've seen, I mean, Dave and his colleagues in Bedford have recently given the go-ahead to a sustainable new development of, I think, 18,000 new homes in Bedford, which will be on the route, on that railway route. But we think that at least 3 major garden cities could be constructed along that route. Tens of thousands of new houses, but crucially, homes built in a properly planned and sustainable way. Not just that the properties themselves are sustainable, by the way, which is quite different. Have you seen this latest Conservative proposal of giving young people poorly insulated homes, which would cost more to heat, and somehow trying to dress it up as a great kind of bargain basement deal for young people? Our approach, by contrast, is build the homes on the scale that is needed, not least through the development of garden cities, not only in a sustainable way in which they're built, but also so that they have access to nature and to green spaces. The 2 other things, I can see the orange lights are coming up. 2 other things I'd point out are policies on electric cars. We've got to get our transport system, our car network down to more sustainable levels. And then something which I think is very close to my heart because I love walking, the completion of the coastal path. It might sound small, but I think it's actually really, really important, because there are lots and lots of people who like to enjoy our countryside, and I can't think of a better way of doing it than completing the coastal path. So those are 3 things to look out for. Right, oh yes, now hands up.
No, if we could just take a supplementary from Jane, who's at the microphone.
Yeah.
Hello, Nick. Thank you for your answer. My question is that I think our members and activists are very motivated by campaigning on the environment and on green policies. And what I'd like to urge is that the green voice of our government is talked about more readily. So for our general election campaign, that environmental policies are up there with all the other issues as a top priority. And my supplementary question is, will you acknowledge that climate change is the top environmental issue, and it actually puts at risk all our other policies that we have in the Lib Dems if we don't campaign harder on climate change?
Yeah, of course. I would just say, I would say 2 things about the significance we attach to climate change. Firstly, we as a country cannot deal with climate change unless we remain leading members of the European Union. It is simple as that. And you know that, and I think maybe we do need to be more forceful in pointing out that pulling out of the European Union, which UKIP wants, and clearly the Conservative Party is now, I think, headed towards the exit sign as well, not only jeopardises jobs, it also jeopardises the kind of sustainable environment we want to hand on to future generations. And the second thing I'd say is, look, I think one of the great things about us as a party is that we are often prepared to think long-term in a way that other parties are not. We're often prepared to say, look, we've got to take some big decisions, uncomfortable decisions, if we want to secure the kind of long-term future. That's what all of these difficult, gory, unpopular decisions around the deficit are all about. They're all about making sure that we clear the decks, wipe the slate clean for the next generation. And I often think that what I'd call a kind of small L liberal approach to having stable public finances so that the next generation don't have to suffer and pay the costs of this generation's debts is exactly the same moral argument that needs to be applied to the environment. We don't have a right as a generation, as this generation, to rob future generations of clean air, good drinking water, and the kind of sustainable environment to which they are entitled just as much as we are. So
it takes a couple of questions from the hall on environmental issues.
Yep. Chat there. And anybody else? I might as well say now the two questioners so that the microphone can be... And over there, yep.
Hi, thank you, Nick. Strike price for tidal energy. You're about to come up with how much you're going to subsidise it. Will you take into consideration the added value, such as coastal protection, tourism and leisure, the growth in the economy, the length of the life of the scheme?
Well, yes, I think is the short answer. And, I think for those who are not familiar with technical terms like strike price and contracts for difference and all the other complicated mechanisms which make up the way in which we, in effect, have created during this Parliament a level playing field between the support given to carbon-intensive energy generation and low-carbon and zero-carbon energy generation, which in the past were always sort of prejudiced, or rather they were almost discriminated against in the way in which the subsidy system worked. I really do think the achievements of Chris Huhne and now Ed Davey are very, very considerable indeed. They have done more than any other politicians in living memory to really, really put a booster under our renewable energy sector. There is now more investment, hundreds of millions of pounds, pouring into renewable energy generation because of what Liberal Democrats did in government. And of that, you should be very, very proud.
Brian Matthew, PPC for North Wiltshire. Nick, can we be assured that we make our green policies the red lines of our future involvement in government?
Well, as you probably have heard in a succession of interviews I did this morning, I'm reluctant to get drawn into red lines. I don't think we should be in the business now of starting to pop up with our various red lines. But I think what we should be clear about, as we were, by the way, in the last manifesto, we should be clear when we come to draft our manifesto what our priorities are. Because clearly, look, a manifesto is a great wad of paper. Each party produces them. But of course, we all know that there are some policies, some values, some principles which are closer to our hearts, which get our blood pumping more than others. And you'll remember at the last general election, we put on the front page of our manifesto the kind of things that we were particularly passionate about. We said that it was an absolute priority for us to make the tax system fairer by raising the personal income tax allowance to 10,000. In fact, we've over-delivered on that. For a party that's constantly being told that we didn't deliver on one of our policies, we actually over-delivered on the policies on the front page of our manifesto, certainly as far as fair taxes are concerned. We said that priority number 2 on the front page of our manifesto was a £2.5 billion commitment to helping the education of those kids who weren't getting the kind of education they need through the pupil premium. Delivered. We said we would play our part to fix the economy, put the banks on a more stable footing, start fixing the public finances, and boost green jobs, as we have done. And fourthly, we said that we would push for political, I think we've certainly pushed for political reform. Whether we have succeeded in achieving it quite on the sweeping scale that we wanted, well, that, of course, was blocked by the vested interests in British politics. But I would suggest that we should take, roughly speaking, a similar approach to our manifesto when we draft the manifesto. In other words, we should say, if not on the front page, on the first few pages of our manifesto, where our heart really kind of lies. And I have absolutely no doubt that in amongst that, the commitment to rewiring our British economy, to make it more sustainable and make it more green, both in terms of, as I say, the kind of natural environment that we all need to enjoy, but crucially also the green jobs that can be created and are being created, I think is clearly something of of great importance to us as a party.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to move on to the next subject area. This is a question from Evan Harris.
Oh, God. Right. Where are you, Evan?
I'll read the question out. What is your view on the police using RIPA powers to access, without judicial oversight, the phone records of our friends in the press?
Hooray! An issue where Evan and I agree. This is fantastic. In fact, not only Evan and I agree, in an unusual constellation, Evan, the Sun newspaper, and the Mail on Sunday all agree. So I think when those three all agree, it is an unstoppable force. And it's an unstoppable force, for those of you who didn't follow the debate, in favour of a very, very important liberal principle. And Evan, thank you very, very much indeed for sort of forcing this issue onto the agenda, for speaking out in favour of a free press, and crucially, speaking out in favour and also putting onto our agenda this week in our conference, the rights of journalists to go about their work without having their work arbitrarily disrupted and arbitrarily investigated by the police, where the police do not need to meet, as Evan can explain better than I can, the same kind of standards of proof or sign-off from the judiciary that they do in other forms of investigation. It's one of the founding principles of a liberal society. And joking aside, Evan, I think it's one of the... It's Evan's dogged sort of allegiance to those founding liberal principles of free speech, of a proper balance of powers, of the privacy of British citizens and of the freedom of the British press is I think, what makes not only Evan a great liberal, but us a great liberal party. And technical though it might seem, it is very important that I think Evan has shone a spotlight on some pretty extraordinary cases where some journalists, just going about their work of finding sources, finding information, publishing what they discover, have subsequently discovered that their own communications records were being investigated, I think I'm right in saying, Evan, without even their knowledge. And that really, I think, is just wholly unacceptable in a liberal society. So, well done, Evan.
Well, I find I'm increasingly agreeing with Nick. Or is it vice versa? Many of the newspapers...
tectonic plates shift.
Many of the newspapers concerned are cheerleaders for the abolition of the Human Rights Act and indeed for the withdrawal or dilution of the European Convention. But they're the same newspapers who are calling for, on issues like this, they're justified, as you've said, rights of freedom of expression to be protected by human rights legislation and to go to Strasbourg. Is there anything you can do with your persuasive ways to explain to them not just the irony, but the utter absurdity of the inconsistency of that position?
Very good. It's an excellent point. It's an excellent point that often the same figures who invoke the proud traditions of British liberty will be the first to discard or call for the discarding of those proud traditions of liberty by saying that we should pull out of remember, a document enshrining universal human rights drafted by British lawyers, promoted by Churchill, embodying so many Anglo-Saxon liberal values, the privacy of the individual, the privacy of the citizen, the rights of us as citizens not to be pushed about, molested and interfered with by the state. And time again, it is British citizens, including British journalists, who are going to the Strasbourg court, quite rightly invoking those ancient British rights, but doing so through the mechanism of the European Convention of Human Rights. And that is why it just perplexes me utterly when you hear people like Chris Grayling now somehow in a desperate, I think pathetic attempt to try and curry favour with UKIP, or at least scamper after UKIP, now saying that they'll chuck those great British principles of liberty overboard. We should be proud of the fact as a country that we were the authors in so many respects of those liberal principles enshrined in that document, which countries like Russia and Belarus and other countries now need to abide by. We shouldn't be running away from them. Yes, let's reform the Strasbourg court. It's hopelessly bureaucratic in many respects. It's dealing with far too many small cases. It's got a long pipeline of cases. Of course, we can change all of that. And Simon is working on that, and Ken Clark before him did great work on that. But let's, for heaven's sake, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Civil liberties, human rights are indivisible. That's what the Conservatives don't seem to understand. It's not as a pick and choose menu. They are indivisible, and we should be proud defenders of them, hook, line, and sinker. I really think if Evan and I are now reveling in agreement like this, there's no more need for a Q&A, because there's no more debate to be had now that that has happened. Yeah. One there, and can I just for the people carrying the microphones, anybody else? Any follow-up? And a gentleman there. Yeah.
So I'm a total fan of the Leveson report, most of it. And
You're a what?
A total fan of
fan.
the I've actually read some of it as well, which was interesting. And I really do applaud you for putting steel in the government's determination to put through the Royal Charter. It must have taken a lot of determination to get it through. But we're left with a situation now that most of the press are forming their own body. I'm not sure, odd gazettes and things may have signed up to the Royal Charter, but we're left with possibly no organisation for the press complaints being set up under it. So you've got to ask, what the heck is the point of the Royal Charter? Is it a lame duck?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And again, Evan is genuinely one of the great sort of experts on all of this. And I'll try not to get, it's quite a lot of sort of techie. I'll try and sort of boil it down to what I think is really at issue here. Lord Justice Leveson, what was ingenious about what he proposed, which is why I think with a totally clean conscience, as defenders of freedom of expression, defenders of a, rough and ready, rumbustious British press, I and all of us advocated it, is that he wasn't advocating state regulation of the press. That would have been anathema to us. We would never have, I would never endorse that. He instead came up with an ingenious system when we said, no, the press, like many other industries, should establish its own body, and it's for the press to do that, not for us as politicians, a self-regulated body. But it needs to be, in order to be effective, of course, in order to provide proper recourse to those hapless, innocent victims who do sometimes get mashed up by the press, whose privacy, and we know that from the past, from Millie Dowler and others, have been invaded, have proper right of appeal, right of remedy through an independent mechanism. So then the question becomes, a rather technical question, how do you ensure that something which is set up by the press is nonetheless properly independent of it? And that's where this thing came, which was that he said, well, you need a recognition body, a sort of body that, how can I put it, from time to time applies a sort of MOT test to the body set up by the press to make sure it's properly independent. And that's what this whole thing, the Royal Charter, was all about. And the Royal Charter is exactly the same way in which we've created the BBC. No one thinks, quite rightly, the BBC is under the thumb of politicians. That was the whole point. We said, well, if it's good for the BBC, which is clearly completely independent and rightly of the political class, then it should be enough. Not for, just to establish the body which then can in turn verify that the body which has been established by the press is independent. So you can see how many steps removed there is between the self-regulating body and the politicians. And then he said something else which is very ingenious. He said, for those parts of the press that do not join that recognized body, recognized by that by that body which is kind of doing the verification, there will be a series of kind of disincentives, or rather, sorry, a series of incentives of the way in which costs and penalties are incurred by the press when cases of wrongdoing are heard, which would encourage them to do so. So it was a system of incentives and self-regulation, and simply a kind of perfectly practical system by which the independence from the vested interests, both political and in the industry, could be verified. I think it's a great, great pity that instead that intelligent, small L liberal mechanism has been portrayed as some threat to liberal principles of the free press, which you and I suspect, believe in as much as we do. And look, I just think we should let this system now run for a bit, because these incentives I think, will increase over time. So let's just give it a bit of time. But that, in a nutshell, I hope an intelligible nutshell, is what Leveson proposed.
Hi, Nick. Sam Fripp from Southampton and Frome. Given the kind of judicial issue, given the legal debate on this, and given the recent judgment, do you think that the Lib Dems should blaze a trail on assisted dying and ensure that we have a parliamentary time for this issue?
I think Parliament should, absolutely, from time to time. That's exactly what parliaments are there for, to have big, serious debates about an issue. I mean, you can't get bigger and more serious than the issue of assisted dying. Two things, however. Firstly, I absolutely don't think this is something which you should be whipping MPs on. This is something of such profound personal conscience. And I, as you perhaps know, I personally am not persuaded that it is sensible for the state to seek to capture in legislation decisions which, and I have some, that's because of my own family, I've seen how it works in other countries like the Netherlands. I personally am quite sceptical about the ability to capture what is a very, very delicate decision about when you endorse under the law the taking of someone's life. And I can understand, totally understand why campaigners feel that this is something which should be done, and I suspect most people in this room believe that we should legislate that. I'm just saying to you quite openly, my own view is I'm not persuaded that it is. I understand the motivation, but I'm quite sceptical that, again, actually, in a sort of old-fashioned liberal way, that trying to craft that in legislation, that agonizingly difficult moral decision about when someone's life can and should they can and should be taken, or assistance should be given in the taking of that life. So I'm not persuaded, but I totally accept this is something which does need to be debated, needs to be debated calmly and sincerely. And my experience is that, on the whole, when it is, it's actually one of those good instances for those people who, and I count myself amongst those, who sometimes, whose faith in how Parliament works is tested to destruction. I'm always immensely impressed by the quality of the debate on this. Just actually, funny enough, precisely because the politics of it is drained. Because it isn't about parties clashing. It's about individuals wrestling with a massive issue of conscience. And we should always play a part in trying to make sure that those debates are held in that considered, thoughtful fashion.
Thank you.
Actually, can I just out of interest, I mean, I know we debated on this past, just out of interest, those, could just hands up those of you who think we should pass a law which permits, obviously, with lots and lots of caveats and criteria and so on, the assisted taking of someone's life in certain circumstances. Hands up who think they should, yeah. No, I realise that I'm in a minority, but I hope it's nonetheless a minority view which can be respected, because I think it does need to be respected in such a delicate issue. Next.
Thank you. Somehow we moved on from...
Oh, by the way, before Miriam and Joe are leaving, and I think they're terribly worried that you're going to think they're storming off in protest at something I've said. But they're not. They're actually going to inspire some school children locally to follow suit.
Thanks. The next question is from Jane Dodds from Montgomeryshire. And we've had a number of questions around the devolution issue and around Scotland and England. But her question is, what would the Liberal Democrats do for Wales after the referendum in Scotland?
Sorry. Thought you were about to ask it. Where are you, Jane? Oh, there you are. Well, look, first things first. When we will, no ifs, no buts, no caveats, no conditions attached by David Cameron and the Conservative Party, when we deliver what is in effect home rule here to Scotland within the United Kingdom, I think we should aspire to deliver home rule to Wales as well. And we've done a great deal already. Everybody knows how ferocious Kirsty and Jenny and others are in promoting the cause of further devolution of powers to Wales. There was this Calman-type cross-party process in Wales. It came in two instalments, Silk 1 and Silk 2, after Mr. Silk, the person who convened it all. We've delivered pretty well all of Silk 1. I was the first party leader to say that as a party, I think we should commit to delivering all of Silk 2. I'm very keen that Jenny, and I know Jenny is doing this already, should work within government so that on the same timetable as the government publishes draft legislative articles on the devolution of powers to Scotland around the beginning of next year, I hope, Jenny's looking rather alarmed by this, but I hope we can seek to do the same for Wales. There's a very important financial component to all of this, which is for reasons that I think most people will appreciate. Everybody believes the Barnett formula is flawed, but no one actually seems to come to an agreement on what is better to improve it. So I think people have rightly said that the Barnett formula should remain in place. But that does leave a big problem, bluntly, for Wales, because I don't think Wales is fairly served by the funding formula at the moment. And that's why we have agreed as a party that we will find a separate financial solution for Wales, even as Barnett continues to be the formula by which finances are distributed elsewhere in the United Kingdom, to address those very particular concerns for Wales. So, look, I think we're part of a really exciting journey across the United Kingdom now, of further devolution powers everywhere, but most especially, and certainly including, Wales.
Good afternoon, Nick. And certainly good afternoon from Montgomeryshire, a seat, as you know, I'm determined to bring back to its rightful home with the Liberal Democrats.
Ah, very good.
My follow-up question is just about timescales. The concern we have in Wales is that we've had and led the argument around Home Rule in terms of the Liberal Democrats for many years, and some would argue for 100 years if you go back to Lloyd George. Our concern is we don't want it to take another 100 years. We don't even want it to take another 100 months. We want it to be done as quickly as possible, and so we're concerned that it'll be held up by the whole kind of concepts and issues that are around English laws for English regions. So can you just give us some assurance around timescales and how quickly you think it'll happen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, well, I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate concern. I don't think that will happen. I really do think the cat's out of the bag now. I just think the kind of the momentum now towards further devolution, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and radically greater decentralisation within England, which of course is the missing bit of the jigsaw in many respects. You know, England is a woefully over-centralised country, I think is now unstoppable. I think it helps considerably, and that's what we saw in the Silk process, that's what we saw in the Calman discussions in Scotland. I think it helps massively when the different party leaders in Wales itself seek to come to an agreement. And I was talking to Kirsty just yesterday about meetings which I think... Are you here, Kirsty? Is she? No, she's not. I think that Kirsty's holding later this week with Carwyn Jones and the leader of the Welsh Conservatives as well, and Applied, to try and kind of really push the boat out in Cardiff. Because I think if all the party leaders in Cardiff say, look, these are the new powers we want, it's very, very difficult for London to refuse, and we can sort of push from the other end, because of course traditionally neither Labour nor the Conservative parties are in the slightest bit interested in devolving power. But I think with that pincer movement, we can really make progress. And then when you come to Westminster as MP for Montgomeryshire, you can do your own bit in pushing from that end as well.
I'll be there.
You're very good. Who wants to... This gentleman here and this gentleman here. It's all gentlemen, am I missing? But... sorry. Yes.
Ian Jones, North East Region. Nick, in the context of the wider devolution debate, could you articulate your position linking your Northern Futures, Cities Futures thing with the issues of combined authorities, of the growth of combined authorities, and above all, a message that I'm getting from businesses in the northeast of England, that they want to see any decisions on devolution not based on emotion, but on sound business cases.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, we've done a lot to kind of relax the sort of clammy grip of Whitehall on the way in which things are run. And I've been very involved in a lot of that. You know, I've pioneered, as you know, the city deals for Newcastle, for Sheffield, Liverpool, Birmingham, for all the big cities across the country. The most unprecedented act of decentralisation of powers, including over money, skills, transport, housing, and so on, that this country's seen in a long time. We've created the Regional Growth Fund, as you know, despite much scepticism at the beginning. I remember when I first proposed it in Whitehall, everyone in Whitehall said, oh, no, you don't need to create a fund like that. I said, of course you need to create a fund, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly for the north of England, which had been so over-reliant under Labour on public subsidies only. Created the local enterprise partnerships. We've devolved control or retention of business rates. But we need to go further. And that's what for those of you not aware, I've created this thing called Northern Futures, which is a kind of open kind of policy forum where everyone across the north of England, in Sheffield, in the northeast and elsewhere, can come forward with their best ideas about how we can really boost the economy of the north of England and finally try and deal with this perennial problem of the north-south divide. And, you know, I think we're making progress. I mean, yesterday I announced that we as a party should provide our full backing to, have you seen this report over the summer from One North? It was all the big northern metropolitan authorities with a new blueprint for transport investment, including a new high-speed Transpennine railway link, a lot of motorway improvements and so on. And I said, look, I think we should back that. And of course, under the fiscal rules that Danny explained yesterday, we can, because we've said, unlike George Osborne, that after 2017-18, when we've wiped the slate clean, we've dealt with the structural deficit, we will prudently and responsibly borrow money for productive investment in our infrastructure, because that's the way, and that's what your business people are telling you, you can raise economic performance. Of course, the Conservatives are saying they won't do that, and instead they'd only fund things like that by hitting people on low incomes, by taking away the support for them at an ever greater scale in the years ahead. I think it's a big difference. I think we stand now for a fair future for the North, funded through a sensible way of investment, where the Conservatives only want to fund that infrastructure investment by hurting people in the North, by taking away support for them. Yeah.
Will Tucker from Croydon. Given the appalling human losses in the recent Gaza conflict and Israel's continued building in illegal occupied areas, how can you justify the UK government's continued export of arms to Israel?
Just before you answer that, can we just remind you in terms of time, we'll need to move on, and we might be taking questions on devolution at this point.
Right. Sorry, I can or I can't take the question?
If you take it, but very briefly, so we can move on.
So very briefly, without going over, as you know, Vince announced over the summer the terms on which we would suspend as a country arms exports to Israel, and set out the basis for that decision. I mean, I share your dismay and despair, frankly, at the loss of innocent life over the summer. And I'm as angered, and I feel as kind of despairing about the reprehensible and appalling tactics of Hamas, not only, by the way, towards their own people, but in terrorizing innocent civilians, as I do by the totally unjustified illegal annexation of land by the Israeli government through the expansion of these settlements. And I only wish that the European Union would act with greater clout in the Middle East. We constantly kind of defer to the United States for exerting influence in the Middle East, when actually the European Union is the biggest recipient of exports from Israel and indeed from Gaza and the West Bank. We're also the biggest donor of aid to that part of it. We have such clout. We're such an economic giant, but we act as a political pygmy in the Middle East, and it frustrates me immensely. If only the French, the Germans, the British, we acted with one voice on this, we could really, I think, apply proper pressure on both sides to do the only thing which makes sense, which is to negotiate a two-state solution for future generations.
I'm afraid we're going to have to move off devolution now and move...
We weren't on devolution.
We were meant to be.
Right, sorry.
And there's a question from Martha Vickers from Newbury. Do you agree with Norman Baker that combating drug abuse is predominantly a health and not a crime issue?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Like so many things we've talked about, the environment, decentralisation, home rule, foreign policy, one of the great things about us as a party is that we sort of say stuff that other parties are not prepared to say, and we are prepared to take the long view about some of the big reforms we need. And drugs reform is just ripe for a breakthrough in this country. And I start from a very simple assertion. If you're anti-drugs, you should be pro-reform. It's as simple as that. The war on drugs is not working. And how long do we have to carry on? How long do we have to carry on making the same mistakes over and over? Now, look, there's some progress has been made, and I want to pay tribute to Norman Baker, who's done brilliant work in the Home Office. We've now got more people in treatment. We've got more money going invested in treatment. We've got some really radical, groundbreaking pilot projects to get health workers, for instance, into police cells so that if people have got drug or alcohol dependency problems, they're treated as well as dealt with in the criminal justice system. We've got new approaches to drug-free wings in prison. But it's kind of baby steps. We could go so much further. And I think one of the ways we could go further is just treat the people with addictions in the way that they need to be dealt with, which is they need help. They need treatment. If you want to get them out of the hands of the criminals, if you really want to be tough on the Mr. Biggs, don't do what we're doing at the moment, which is imprisoning still hundreds of people in our prisons for personal possession. Right? No other crime, just personal possession. I mean, they end up in prison often for a few weeks. Guess what happens? Surprise, surprise, they end up getting hooked on harder drugs, end up hanging out with hardened criminals, and they come out as either criminals who inflict further misery on other victims or become even more hapless victims of the criminal gangs who sold them the drugs in the first place. How idiotic is that? So you're not actually dealing with the health problem, and you're actually making it easier for the criminals to derive profits off those addicts. So I think we should move the issue of drug addiction from the Home Office into the Department of Health and allow the Home Office to free up its resources to go after the nasty Mr. Biggs, who we should be much tougher on and should have been all along.
Thank you for that answer, Nick. Can I just ask you, is it true that the Conservatives have blocked an international comparative study on this issue initiated by Norman Baker?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid, look, the Conservatives drag their feet on this constantly. So do you remember they stopped, was it a couple of years ago, they stopped a totally sensible suggestion. I think it was endorsed by various select committees in the House of Commons. We called for it, which is, let's look at the evidence. Let's not be driven by fear or panic or worry that the headlines won't be good. In fact, by the way, on that, I actually think significant parts of the British media and certainly significant swathes of British society are now much more progressive and thoughtful on this than large parts of the political class. It's one of those classic examples where the political class is behind the rest of the country. And so when we suggested, look, let's have a royal commission, so we take the politics out of this and look at it thoughtfully and be led by the evidence, they blocked it. Norman Baker commissioned some time ago something which we'll get it out there eventually. We will win this internal argument, but we basically said that the Home Office, for the first time ever, will review the evidence of what is happening in other countries where drugs reform is taking place, places like Switzerland, New Zealand, Portugal, and so on. And that report is, candidly at the moment, stuck in the bowels of Whitehall because for one reason or another the Conservatives don't want to get the evidence out there. And I think there's nothing wrong for people to just have the freedom to look at what they do in other countries so that then people can make up their own minds about how we compare to what works or doesn't work in those other countries. It will be published. We will get it out there eventually. It's just, once again, rather frustrating that on something where we could be leading the debate, the Conservatives in government are being so frightfully conservative.
Thank you.
Yeah, Katie. And so who else put their hand up? And, yes, I can't see you, and you over there, yeah. Katie first.
Thank you. Katie Gordon, Eastern Berkshire. You mentioned the Tories dragging their feet in relation to drugs. And I'm going to cheekily shoehorn in dragging their feet on greater powers and federalism and wondering whether you have to hold David Cameron's feet to the fire in private or whether he genuinely gets it.
I think, I mean, my experience of the Conservatives, and indeed actually the Labour Party on constitutional reform generally, is that they have absolutely no interest at all in wholesale, coherent constitutional reform. They'll pick off the things which they think are of narrow political advantage, but anything which threatens the way their kind of vested interest in the political system, and they are utterly ruthless in blocking it. I mean, look, you know, they both had manifesto commitments to Lord's reform. They buried it. The Labour Party's own manifesto commitment was for the alternative vote. It wasn't our proposal. We stuck it on the ballot paper for the referendum. They didn't lift a finger to help to win the argument. And on party funding, despite solemn pledges in their manifesto that they would deliver it, when David Laws actually convened a cross-party group, guess what happens? The vested interests from the trade unions in the Labour Party and from big finance in the Conservative Party killed it dead. So what's happened now is the Conservatives have thought, oh, well, what we are interested in is English votes for English matters. Actually, if you listen to them, they're not really interested in fair votes for English matters. They're interested in Tory votes for English matters. Because they think the rest of us haven't rumbled them and haven't worked out that they've come up with this clever wheeze that even though they only got 38% or whatever it is, 38% of the vote in England last time, somehow, because they're overrepresented because of our loopy electoral system, they can use that minority vote to basically run roughshod over everybody else in Westminster forever and anon. Well, clearly we're not going to allow that to happen. And that's why David Laws quite rightly said 3 days ago, OK, if you want a serious proposal, a genuine proposal to deal with this perfectly legitimate issue, by the way, of how you process and vote and debate on matters which are only relevant to England and Wales, then let's create a committee of English and indeed English and Welsh MPs, 50-odd, I mean, it doesn't matter the number, but, you know, sizable, but make sure that the MPs who are on it are there in proportion to the votes cast by the voters at the last election, not allow it basically to become just a stitch up by the Conservative Party. That's a really sensible proposal. I think we've thrown the ball back in the court of the Conservatives. They now need to come clean. Were they interested all along in genuine, fair, thoughtful constitutional reform, or was it all along actually just a wheeze to try and get one over all the other parties in Westminster and/or kind of put something on leaflets in the Clacton by-election? Let's see if they're serious or not.
We've got time for that. One brief supplemental and then one more question.
Cara Jenkinson from Haringey. Are you concerned that the privatisation of the probation service is going to fatally undermine the service and impact our ability to cut reoffending, including drug reoffending?
We should speak to Simon. I don't actually think, in theory and in principle, that having a mixture of a public probation service dealing with the most serious offenders, but having other groups, including, you know, really highly accomplished charities and organisations which for years have been doing great work in the community to cut reoffending. I don't think, in theory, having them involved as well or giving them a bigger role should you know, by definition, be a bad thing. And as long as they can work together in effective partnership and that they can track offenders that, as they do, often move from being low risk to high risk, and you have a sort of properly integrated system between the public probation service and the voluntary or the private one, I see no reason why it shouldn't actually be beneficial. And, you know, I know that obviously NAPO and other organisations representing probation officers, and I met them many, many times in my constituency, and they're brilliant probation officers. They do outstanding work. But I think sometimes we need to accept that there are ideas from outside the public probation service which are often very, very innovative and smart in cutting reoffending, and we should incorporate those bright ideas into the way in which the probation service works. Is that the right answer, Simon?
Thank you.
He's nodding.
Thank you. I've got time for just one more question. Unfortunately, there won't be a supplementary to this, but it's from Steve Bradley, PPC for Bath. The 2013 Special Olympics in Bath were a huge success. What role do you believe sport can play in enriching the lives of those with intellectual disability?
Aren't there some special Olympians and competitors here today? Where are you? Ah, there you are. Oh, hello. Hi. They can't see you because they're downstairs, and I can't see you because you're sitting behind a shocking very big light, but I can just... So for those of you who don't know, the Special Olympics, the Special Games for athletes with intellectual disabilities, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And we met in Downing Street recently, didn't we? Or at least some of us did. And it was held in Bath in 2013. It's going to be held in Sheffield in 2017. And the European Special Games, was that what it's called? Was held in Antwerp just over the last few weeks. And I know that our Special Olympians performed exceptionally well. So I think all it really leaves for me to say is, can everybody give a fantastic round of applause to the athletes there?
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the time that's allocated to us. I know I always say this is the end of this session, but I really do mean it. I think I'd really like to thank you for taking questions not only that have been submitted in advance, but from the hall, which you haven't known about, on a whole wide range of subjects, from devolution to drugs, press, environmental issues, and a few others that suddenly crept in to that list. So thank you very much. We are very grateful to you.
Thanks.